Hello and welcome to Let's Talk. We have, in previous editions, we've spoken to the governor of Hong Kong, we've spoken to politicians, people in the world of business and sport, but this week we're here in London speaking to a diplomat, Andrew Heyn, who was the British Consul-General in Hong Kong during the very demanding period of the 2019 protests and indeed the introduction of the national security law in 2020. And he has a lot of interesting things to say, both about that and generally about British policy towards Hong Kong and the PRC. So you've been a diplomat for over 3 decades, and I'd like to invite you to be less diplomatic during this interview. I'm just wondering, I mean, among the highlights of your career were being ambassador in Myanmar or Burma and Consul-General in Hong Kong. You know, a lot of people say that the problems that are faced in Myanmar and in Hong Kong, etc., these are all legacies of British colonialism. What would your response be to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there is something in it, but I don't, and that did come up quite a lot in both places where people were, we might be talking to some Chinese officials about, problem X or problem Y, and they would often go back to, well, this is a colonial era. It all stemmed from there, and you'd hear the same sometimes in Myanmar. On the other hand, in the case of Myanmar, when I went there, it had been, you were a long way on from independence. In the case of Hong Kong, you were pretty long way on from 1997. So to keep harking back to this is all a problem caused by colonialism was probably stretching it a bit, shall we say. Because a lot of people said in 2019, and certainly after the introduction of the national security law in 2020, that Britain, which had a residual interest in Hong Kong, didn't step up to the mark in terms of supporting the democracy movement. I would argue, you asked me to not be diplomatic, but actually, and I'm not being diplomatic, I think that would be a pretty unfair accusation. Because the British government, and I was part of it at that time as a diplomat working for the British government, we had to think about what is it we can actually do. Obviously our role was to defend as much as we could the one country, two systems and the high degree of autonomy. So that was what we were aiming to do. When it became clear with the national security law that China had effectively demolished one of the key pillars of Hong Kong's high degree of autonomy and the freedoms and the space for political discourse, we had to think about what our response would be. Now, if you think about what we had, we could obviously organize all the international statements and make our own bilateral statements and do all that. We could suspend our extradition arrangement and do something on arms embargoes and all of that. But what we did with the British National Overseas Passport move was transformative. And that was really our most powerful response. And it was not easy to get that done because you know how sensitive the immigration issue is in the UK. Now, what we were talking about there was effectively an undetermined number of Hong Kongers who might use the BNO passport route, which was opened up as a result, the freedom to study and work and path to citizenship.
How many people at the time did you think would take advantage of the BNO route to citizenship?
Yeah, I mean, it was so difficult to estimate. And I'm trying to remember back, I can remember figures of maybe around 100,000 but I mean, it really was like sticking a finger in the air and trying to, as it happened, I think it's around 200,000.
Well, it's closer to 250,000, isn't it?
Well, so I've heard, I mean, the numbers are, but yes, you're into that
difficult
zone. Yes.
But I mean, was it sensitive purely because you thought that there would be a backlash against a new source of immigration? Was it sensitive because Britain was worried about angering the PRC? I'm just wondering what all these considerations were.
No, I mean, the angering the PRC was pretty low down the list. Immigration was, and the potential response in the UK both within government, because again, you know about the issues on immigration right now, but they were just as live at that time. This was one of the issues that the government at that time was grappling with and facing a lot of criticism for immigration numbers. And that was the extraordinary thing, was that when we had time to think about, well, if China do something like the national security law, what responses could we have? So we were able, working with colleagues in London, to try to work through and get ready for what we might do, including trying to, as it were, smooth the path within government to allow this move to happen. And that meant the key department obviously was the Home Office, but others had a big interest.
Was the Home Office resistant?
No. And that was extraordinary.
It is extraordinary. I mean, the recently released documents from the earlier period, that's the period after Tiananmen, in 1989, say that Britain was in fact preparing, or at least considering, a mass evacuation from Hong Kong. Did that reoccur? I mean, did that thought reoccur, I should say?
The thought reoccurred, particularly at a point where, I'd like to come back, if I may, to the BNO issue, but there was a point when the airport was occupied by protesters. There was violence. This was probably around August and September, I think, of 2019. And there was a lot of evidence of a build-up on the border. You may remember this yourself, with the PLA in Shenzhen and around Shenzhen, and the risks they might come across the border and what we might do about that. Now, the reality of trying to arrange a mass evacuation from Hong Kong doesn't actually bear thinking about. But yes, it was one of those things that was being considered. I don't think it could ever have been done. But what I think was the key point, I sat in a meeting room in the secure zone of our consulate in Hong Kong with a lineup of meeting chaired by Dominic Raab, the then Foreign Secretary, with most of the cabinet around on these like a Zoom call, and Priti Patel, the then Home Secretary, was one of those people, and she was 100% supportive of the BNO passport route. So not only within government did you have, perhaps surprisingly, given the backdrop, absolute support for it.
I mean, it's very interesting because Priti Patel, is quite a hardliner on immigration issues.
And I think that demonstrated how special the Hong Kong relationship was. But the other part of it that was really interesting is that the groups you would have expected to be shouting about immigration, so the political parties, the ones who are anti-immigration, some of the organizations who oppose immigration, they didn't. Or if they did, it was really muted. It wasn't one of these big campaigns. And I think that demonstrated a very special relationship between the UK and Hong Kong. And I think a genuine sense we need to do something as part of our historic responsibility to Hong Kong, and this is the best thing we can do.
The United Kingdom will keep its word. We will live up to our responsibilities to the people of Hong Kong. And I can tell the House that after further detailed discussions with my right honourable friend, the Home Secretary, I can now confirm we will proceed to honour our commitment to change the arrangements for those holding BNO status. And I can update honourable members that we have worked with ministers right across Whitehall, and we have now developed proposals for a bespoke immigration route for BNOs and their dependents.
And the atmosphere in the consulate while you were observing the demonstrations, observing what was happening, was what?
I think there was a lot of concern about where will this go, because China's modus operandi in these cases is a clampdown, and potentially you mentioned Tiananmen as being, that's probably the most striking example of that. So there was a lot of concern about where this might lead. Equally, trying to think, well, what, if anything, can we and can the international community do to try to help this? I mean, for example, when it was the extradition bill that set this, started all of this, and it wasn't just us Brits. Most of the international community were advising Caroline. You have to obviously be quite careful in that. It's she was the chief executive, but do you think there might be an idea to have a pause here? And then after things kicked off, saying trying to get an independent inquiry into what had happened with the police and so on. So there was a mix of concern, but also trying to help. I don't know in the end whether that help amounted to very much in terms of that particular time.
And in that period, of course, there was the arrest of Simon Cheng in Shenzhen. What did you do when you heard he'd been arrested?
God, I mean, it was shock. that he'd been arrested. And the thing that we really had to try to find out, well, where is he? And that took a long time to find out, I mean days. And of course we were making the representations both in Hong Kong and in Beijing and in Shenzhen. Where is he? We have a right to know where he is, and more important, his family have a right to know where he is.
But you never obtained consular access to him as far as I know.
No, he eventually came back, but no, it was a pretty dark episode all round. I mean, thank God he did come back, but he clearly went through an absolutely appalling time there.
Here, of course.
Yes, yeah. Open the basket. Right. Okay. First one. Right. Yes, I remember these, and during COVID and during the protests, I remember these. I also remember when I would come back to the UK sometimes with my wife, and the UK didn't take COVID as seriously as people did in Hong Kong. So straight away in Hong Kong, people wore their masks, I think probably because of the experience of SARS. When he went back to the UK in the early days before COVID got really serious, and he walked around wearing a mask, people in the UK thought you were bonkers or weird. So if I put this back, then I go for the next item, and I'm going to choose this one. And this, I remember very vividly. I'm 20 kilos lighter now than I was when I was in Hong Kong, and it was mainly eating the beautiful food. So let's see what's in here, because I'm very glad to see this will not affect my waistline. It's completely empty, and my wife will be very pleased because she's very worried I'm going to get fat again. Now this one, I never saw one. I saw many umbrellas, and of course I remember all of the umbrellas during the protests, and I'm sure I must have seen a fluorescent yellow one, but I don't necessarily remember it. I can see one more item here, and then there's this collapsing item. Yes, remember this very well, traveling around with the octopus card, and my daughter, who lived and worked in Hong Kong for a year, I was very lucky because I had a car with a driver and a flag on the front, and she forced me to say, you get out of your car and travel on the MTR, and so I had one of these.
Where did you longest travel?
Well, all over, but often over to Kowloon side, and wherever my daughter told me I had to go, really. She was very good at taking me around some of the islands as well. Well, all sorts of things. I remember some of the messages that were put on some of these post-it notes around, also how people started using blank messages subsequently later, not necessarily on these notes, so that they couldn't say anything which might breach the national security law. It says, the UK standing with Hong Kong today, tomorrow and into the future. Signed by me.
If you fast forward, and I know you're not there now, but if you fast forward to today, no British consular representative has managed to visit Jimmy Lai in jail, which is, I think, quite an extraordinary thing.
Yeah,
because
I don't think it's for the lack of trying.
Well, is that right? Because there does seem to be an impression that there's just a cursory attempt to send off an email every now and again saying, can we visit our national Mr. Jimmy Lai, and nothing happens.
Well, look, I can't speak for what's happening there now. I would be astonished if that were the case. I mean, I know who my successor well, and I think he will be trying every means that he can to get access. And I notice actually whenever David Lammy, for example, the Foreign Secretary, talks about Hong Kong, he talks about, Jimmy Lai is right up there straight away, including in the relationship with China. So I think any accusation, and I'm not a government official anymore, but I know how these things work, and I've read the statements that come out, and any suggestion that the UK government is being, somehow doesn't care is, I think, completely wide of the mark.
And the other thing, of course, is that you have been cited in his trial as a person who collaborated or incited. I'm never quite sure what you did.
All sorts from the side of it.
Let me just ask you for the record. You obviously will have, well, I assume you met Jimmy Lai. He was a prominent newspaper publisher in Hong Kong. What form of collaboration could you have had which would have undermined Hong Kong's national security?
Absolutely none. I mean, literally none. And that, I mean, of all the Jimmy Lai case, I think sort of lays bare the national security law and everything that's wrong with it. In that, and I actually brought this quote with me, which I thought was expressed it better. This is from Keelan Gallagher, the head of his international legal team. And I tried to think, could I do any better than this? And I definitely can't. I quote here, "Mr. Lai is in effect charged with the crimes of conspiracy to commit journalism, conspiracy to talk about politics with politicians, and conspiracy to discuss human rights issues with human rights organisations." And that's...
And when you met him, what was the...
We talked very. It was actually we talked only very briefly, but
you only met him once.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
Small conspiracy.
Yes, it was a pretty small one. Over at the premises of Apple Daily, but because they were, we had to be conscious of actually the British Consul-General, because of the situation was getting more and more tense. So although it exploded in 2019. From my time arriving in 2016, the tension with this obsession about anti-independent, crushing the so-called independence movement in Hong Kong, things were getting more and more tense. So we had to be a little bit careful. It wouldn't be helpful to the likes of Jimmy Lai for us to be bowling out, a senior level every week at Apple Daily.
So, I mean, this is, I know this is a very big topic of debate, but let me put it to you. I mean, the suggestion has been made, oh, well, if you hadn't have had the protests in 2019 or the earlier protests in the Umbrella Revolution or whatever, it would all be fine. Do you really believe that's so?
I don't know. I felt that when I look back at my time there, I arrived at the time where the LegCo elections of 2016 had just happened. But it became very clear very early on to me that there was a legacy of the Occupy Central movement that had never really been addressed. It had just been sort of smoothed over. And the election of the localist MPs, and then the oath-taking saga, which I'm sure you remember, and all of that, and would they be banned or allowed to do it again, and so on. And it then became very obvious there is a simmering pot here. What very few people expected was that Carrie Lam, with her extradition bill, would put a load of wood and petrol under the pot and throw a match on it. And I don't think she meant to do that, but that's what happened. I think that what happened in the response to the extradition bill was going to emerge somewhere at some time pretty soon, either then or soon after that. I think there were just too many unresolved questions and too much. And it's it's what governments do, and I can kind of understand it. But quite often it's just, can we get through the latest crisis and not really address the root cause of it? And so my view is that what flared up as a result of the extradition bill and all that then flowed from that would have happened at some point.
And let me finally come back to your. A lot of people a lot of diplomats, I should say, who I've met during the years in Hong Kong say, oh, this is the best posting I've ever had. Was it for you?
No. And it was professionally fascinating, but it was actually quite a sad posting, because I think a way of life in Hong Kong stopped. The fact is, I think the figures are somewhere but in the mid 100,000s of Hong Kongers who've left, not leaving aside the ones who've come here. That demonstrates people who decided in the end there was no future for them in Hong Kong. Now, I appreciate there's a lot of people who've stayed and are making a life in Hong Kong, but it was professionally and personally very sad to see that. And people I know, politicians I know, are amongst some of those people now in prison or facing trial. And of course it was a time of COVID, the national security law had come in, and it was with a sense of sadness really that I left the place. And despite having really good friends there, people were incredibly welcoming. But actually, sorry Steve, just one last point on this. Also to see the relationship I had with the Hong Kong authorities, whereas I've been able to, up until the introduction of the national security law, pretty much be able to ring up any of them and say, look, can I come in and have a chat about whatever it might be? And near the end, the answer to that was no. Even to my farewell, in some cases, my farewell calls. And that was a sad way to leave.
It is. Well, look, Andrew Heyn, thank you very much indeed.